Sunlight lazily filters through the cracks in the old curtains, casting striped patterns on the scratched parquet floor. I stare at the ceiling, aware that my alarm clock is screeching for the third time. I get up, not because I want to, but because it's a habit. At some point, I stopped waking up with a desire to do anything. Now everything feels like autopilot. I throw on my robe and head to the kitchen. The coffee maker begins to hum, filling the air with a rich, bitter aroma. I walk to the window and gaze outside. The city is already awake. Cars honking, people rushing about. I watch them and think, they are living. And me? It's not that I'm unhappy, but the feeling that my life is stuck in pause won't let me go. This apartment, my relationship with Mike. Everything feels frozen, like we're trapped in the past, refusing to admit we lost something important a long time ago. I hear footsteps behind me. It's Mike. He steps into the kitchen, his hair sticking up in all directions, eyes still sleepy. A phone in his hand. Mike always has something to do. By now, he's already checking something important, though he hasn't even asked me how I slept. Good morning. His voice is quiet, almost lifeless. His eyes don't leave the screen. Morning, I reply, trying to keep my tone neutral. We haven't talked to each other just for the sake of talking in a long time. It's all short phrases now, discussions about work schedules or shopping lists. No deep conversations anymore. I make coffee while he scrolls through his phone. There was a time when I loved watching him. How he furrowed his brow, lost in thought, or smiled faintly at something funny. Now it irritates me. Not because he's doing anything wrong, but because I can't remember the last time we laughed together. This apartment needs renovating, I say, my voice louder than I expected. The words burst out spontaneously, but as I say them, I realize they're true. Mike lifts his gaze from the phone, looking at me in surprise. Renovating? He asks. His tone is wary, as if I'd suggested something strange. You want to change something? Yes. I nod, trying to explain. These walls, these old wallpapers. Everything here feels so lifeless. I think if we updated the apartment, it might feel lighter. I see him thinking it over. Mike is always serious, always looking for logical explanations. He nods, slowly, as if weighing my words. Maybe you're right. This place has been needing some updates for a while. But it's not just about the apartment, is it? His eyes meet mine, and I don't know how to respond. He keeps talking, but I've stopped listening. I stare at the coffee cup in my hands, lost in thought. Do I really believe that repainting the walls will save us? Or am I just trying to distract myself, to focus on something so I don't have to think about the deeper problems? Do you want me to find someone to help with the renovations? His voice pulls me back to reality. I look up. No, I'll handle it, I reply, though I'm not sure I believe it myself. Mike sets his phone aside and looks at me. His eyebrows are slightly raised. He's clearly trying to gauge if I'm serious. To him, these are just words, but for me, it's a step that might open the door to something new. Though, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what I want. Renovate the apartment, he repeats, more to himself than to me. There's doubt in his voice. Do you think it'll help? I don't know. I answer honestly, taking a sip of coffee. The bitterness barely registers, as if all my senses have dulled. But it can't make things worse. These walls. They feel like they're suffocating me. Everything here is so outdated, tired. I pause for a moment, realizing how that sounds. Because of course, it's not just about the apartment. Mike nods, as if my words have finally made sense to him. He's always been practical. If there's a problem, there's a solution. And I can see him already forming one. If you think it's necessary, let's do it. But we'll need to hire someone to speed things up, he says, leaning back in his chair. His tone is calm, as usual. For him, this is nothing complicated. Just another task to complete. I'm swamped at work right now, and you... Well, you're busy too. Busy with what? I chuckle dryly. There's no work, no real hobbies in my life right now. Just emptiness that I try my best to ignore. Mike doesn't seem to notice. Or maybe he pretends not to. He looks at me seriously, as though he hasn't caught my sarcasm. I can call Adam. Remember my cousin? He's in town temporarily looking for work. He's great with his hands. If he agrees, it'll go faster. Adam? I repeat, recalling him. A young, energetic guy who always seemed overly confident for his age. The last time I saw him was about 5 years ago at a family dinner, where he enthusiastically talked about his grand plans for the future. Since then, I haven't thought much about him. Yeah, he's a good guy. I'm sure he'll be easy to work with. He's done renovation work before, knows his stuff. I try to imagine him walking through our apartment, changing the walls, the furniture, and at the same time disrupting the silence that has long become a part of this home. The thought unsettles me a little. I don't know, Mike. Are you sure it's a good idea? A stranger in our home? I trail off, not finishing the thought, though he's not exactly a stranger. Still, Mike smirks as if my worry amuses him. It's Adam. What's the big deal? If you don't want him, we can do it ourselves, but it'll take a lot more time. And you just said you're tired of all this. He's right. I did say that. I am tired. But is that enough reason to let someone else in? I hesitate, turning the idea over in my mind. Finally, I give in. Fine. Call him, I say with a sigh. Maybe it's not that important. Mike nods in satisfaction, like he's just solved an important problem at work. To him, this is just a small domestic matter. To me, it feels like this conversation has opened up a new crack inside me. He gets up, kisses me on the forehead, a gesture that lost its warmth long ago, and goes to get ready. I stay in the kitchen, once again alone, as though the conversation never happened. In the evening, Mike came home a bit earlier than usual. He looked pleased. Apparently, he had managed to finalize arrangements with Adam. His cheerful tone gave it away as he announced. He agreed. He'll stop by tomorrow to check what needs to be done. He's a good guy, Jess, Mike added, noticing my reserved reaction. He'll save us a ton of time and money. He'll get it done quickly and professionally. Plus, it's only temporary. All right, I replied briefly, knowing there was no point in arguing. The decision had already been made. The next day, I heard the doorbell. I opened the door to find Adam standing there. A slight smile, confident posture. He was taller than I remembered, and he looked more mature. But that restless energy, like a current flowing through him, was still there. He wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, a toolbox in hand. Hi, Jessica, he said, drawing out my name as if savoring it. His voice was warm, but there was a hint of mischief, as if he knew more than he let on. Good to see you again. Mike told me you're diving into a big project. I nodded, feeling awkward. Yes, thanks for agreeing to help. Don't mention it. Beats sitting around bored in my apartment. Besides, I'm curious to see what can be done here. He stepped inside, looking around. Wow, there's a lot to do. But that's a good thing. I like a challenge. His lightness caught me off guard. Mike was so practical, so serious, while Adam, he was like the wind. Free, effortless. Standing next to him, I felt a bit out of place. Mike will be here soon, I said, as though trying to justify my unease. Adam smirked. No worries. We can take a look around in the meantime. Show me what you're planning to change. I led him through the rooms, explaining the ideas we had. Adam listened carefully, occasionally offering suggestions. His enthusiasm was infectious. At some point, I realized that his easygoing attitude was chipping away at the tension that had enveloped me for so long. He made everything seem so straightforward, cracking jokes, talking about his experiences, and sharing a story about a renovation project he once helped with that turned into a disaster. I found myself smiling, almost involuntarily. There you go, you're smiling already, he remarked, catching me off guard. I just remembered a funny story, I lied, turning away. For some reason, I felt uncomfortable that he had noticed something Mike hadn't in a long time. When Mike arrived, Adam was already sketching out a plan of action. The two of them quickly dove into discussing what needed to be bought and who would handle what. I listened to their conversation, sensing the friendly, almost familial rapport between them. They laughed, joked, and bantered. It should have reassured me, but for some reason, it only made me feel more unsettled. After Adam left, I stood in the living room staring at the old wallpaper. Nothing extraordinary had happened, yet a strange sense of foreboding lingered. Maybe it was just nerves. Or maybe it was the way he had looked at me when he said, "There you go. You're smiling already." The next morning, I heard a clatter outside the door. Opening it, I saw Adam, carrying a heap of tools and a box tucked under his arm. "Good morning, Jessica," he greeted with a smile, lifting the box like a trophy. "Time to work some magic." I smirked, stepping aside to let him in. "Do you always start the day with this much energy?" "Well, you know, coffee helps." He winked, strolling past me into the living room. And the prospect of making this house, well, at least a couple of percent more modern. We started with the living room. The walls had been begging for attention for years. The wallpaper was cracked, the corners faded, and one wall bore a strange, dark streak. Mike said it was from an old flood. Adam effortlessly suggested replacing the wallpaper and adding bright accents to liven up the space. "What do you think about turquoise?" he asked, flipping open a catalog. I glanced at the color and shook my head. "Too bold. Mike wouldn't approve. He prefers neutral tones." Adam smirked. "And you? Do you like it?" I hesitated. It was an odd question, mostly because no one had asked me what I liked in a long time. Mike always seemed to know best, and I'd grown used to agreeing without a second thought. "I guess so, but better to go with something calmer," I replied, trying to sound confident. Adam just chuckled softly, as if he saw through my words. The work progressed quickly. Adam moved with remarkable ease, as if this wasn't hard labor but more like a hobby. He kept joking and sharing stories from his life. When he talked about his travels, I caught myself listening with a hint of envy. How could he be so free, so unburdened? "One day, I'll open my own cafe," he said while peeling off the old wallpaper. "Somewhere by the coast. A cozy spot with great coffee, amazing pastries, and loads of plants. A place where people can relax and feel at home." "Ambitious," I commented, scraping a patch of old paint off the wall. "Yeah, but life without ambition is boring, right?" He turned to me, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "What about you, Jessica? What are your dreams?" I froze. Dreams? When was the last time I thought about that? My life had become a series of routine actions, from which I no longer expected anything. Dreams? They felt distant, foreign. "I'm not sure," I admitted, keeping my eyes down. "I guess I just want things to be simpler." "Sometimes, to make things simpler, you need to change something drastically," he said, returning to his work. His words lingered in my mind, even as we moved to another part of the room. At some point, I realized I was laughing at one of his jokes. It was such a small moment, but it felt like it shifted something in me. When was the last time I laughed so freely? Adam was different. It was as though he was drawing out parts of me I'd long thought lost. By the time Mike came home that evening, I was exhausted but satisfied. The living room already looked different, even though the work was far from done. Adam, still brimming with energy, began explaining to Mike what they planned to do next. I listened to their conversation, feeling out of place. Mike didn't seem to notice I was there while Adam spoke. When Mike stepped out to take a call, Adam turned to me. "You did a good job today. I think you should do more things that make you happy." "It's just a renovation," I said, hiding a smile. "Maybe, but, sometimes renovations aren't just about walls." His voice softened, and I felt a faint stir inside me, as if he'd said something profound. I looked at him silently, unsure how to respond. The day began as usual. A light breakfast, a few brief exchanges with Mike, who hurried off to work, and then the quiet that enveloped the house after his departure. Adam arrived around 10 in the morning, as always, with his bright smile and boundless energy. We continued working in the living room. This time, I helped him carry boxes of tools and materials. It was heavy work, but I didn't complain. The feeling of doing something productive, no matter how small, brought me a strange sense of relief. "You sure you've got that?" Adam asked, glancing at the box I was lifting. "Yes, it's fine," I replied. But the moment the words left my mouth, my foot caught on the edge of the old carpet. Everything happened in a split second. The box slipped from my hands. I stumbled and almost fell. If Adam hadn't been there to catch me. His hands gripped me firmly, steadying me before I could hit the ground. Everything around us seemed to freeze. The room, time, even our breathing. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. I nodded, but I couldn't look away. Our eyes met, and I felt something strange and unsettling. A magnetic pull that left me both curious and afraid. "Thank you," I said, stepping out of his grasp, my heart still pounding far too loudly. "No problem," he replied. But there was something else in his tone, something I couldn't quite identify. He lingered a moment longer, and I felt my cheeks flush. The rest of the day passed in an unusual quiet. I tried to focus on the work, avoiding his gaze. But every time he came near, his presence felt palpable, as if the air between us had grown heavier. "You know, Jessica," he said as we were wrapping up for the day, his voice gentle. "You worry too much. Sometimes you have to let yourself relax, even if it's just for a moment." I looked up at him but couldn't find the words to respond. His words were simple, but they struck a chord deep inside me, something I had tried to keep buried. Maybe he saw more than I wanted him to. Maybe, deep down, I wanted someone to notice. When he left, I stayed behind in the living room. Everything around me looked the same, but inside, something had shifted. I stared at the walls we'd spent the day covering with new wallpaper, wondering, what is happening to me? In the morning, Mike mentioned that he'd be late coming home. "We've got a big meeting," he said, fastening his cuffs. His voice was distant, like it was an excuse he'd had to give too many times. I just nodded, saying nothing. Lately, I'd stopped asking questions. The answers didn't seem to matter anymore. When Adam arrived, he brought a list of supplies. "We're running low on pretty much everything," he said, shaking the paper. "You'll need to pick up paint and decor. Mike's busy, so I suggest we go together. I can't carry all of this on my own anyway, and your input would definitely help." I hesitated. A trip with Adam? It felt like crossing some unspoken line. But it was just for the renovation, just a quick errand. I couldn't find a reason to say no. "All right," I replied shortly. "When do we leave?" "Right now, if you're ready." The drive to the store was longer than I expected. The car was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. Adam drove confidently, one hand on the wheel, occasionally glancing at me. He turned on the radio, filling the car with soft, unobtrusive music. It was unexpectedly pleasant. "Have you lived in this neighborhood long?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Long enough to know every pothole on the road," I answered with a smile. He laughed, and for a moment, I felt a little lighter. "You know, it's always interesting to me how people choose where to live. Do you feel like this place is yours?" His tone was still light, but there was a seriousness beneath it. I thought about it. Had this house ever felt like mine? When Mike and I first moved in, I imagined it would be our little haven, a place where we could build something together. But over the years, it had become just a space where we existed. Nothing more. "Sometimes it feels like I'm just a guest here," I said finally. "Like this place never really became home." He nodded briefly, as if he understood. "That's normal. Sometimes a place is just a place. A home is something else entirely." At the store, Adam surprised me. He not only knew what to look for, but also had an eye for detail I didn't expect. He suggested a light blue paint for the bedroom and a few unique decorative elements for the living room. When I hesitated, he convinced me with ease, his words carrying a weight that my doubts couldn't counter. At the checkout, he laughed as I struggled to fit everything into the cart. "Did you know renovation is basically a sport? We're definitely working on our fitness." I smiled. It was such a simple moment, but it reminded me again how long it had been since I laughed so freely. On the way back, we talked more. Adam shared stories of failed relationships, including one where he thought he'd found the one, only to realize they had completely different views on life. His openness was unexpected but disarming. "And you?" he asked suddenly, casting me a quick glance. "What keeps you here?" "Keeps me?" I repeated, caught off guard. His question was blunt but honest. "What makes you stay if this place doesn't feel like home?" My hands tightened involuntarily into fists. I didn't know how to answer. His words, his question, they were too close to the things I avoided asking myself. But for some reason, I wanted to answer him. Him, not Mike. "Habit, I guess," I said quietly. "Stability. I always thought that was important, but, his voice softened, almost inaudible. "Sometimes I feel like it's not enough," I finished, not looking at him. He didn't press further. He just nodded, as if he'd heard all he needed to. When we got back home, I felt strange. His words, his questions swirled in my mind. Maybe he was just overly observant. Or maybe I'd allowed him to see things I kept hidden from everyone else. We began unloading the boxes, and at one point our hands brushed. It was fleeting, but something inside me stirred again. I quickly pulled away, focusing on the task at hand, but the feeling lingered for the rest of the evening. The day had been exhausting. After the trip to the store, Adam and I barely had time to unpack the boxes and start working on the bedroom. The walls were uneven, and the paint didn't go on smoothly. By evening, Mike called to let me know he'd be working late. "Don't wait up for me tonight," he said with a light humor in his voice. But beneath it, I could sense yet another reason for the resentment that had long since become routine. When Adam offered to stay late to finish what we'd started, I couldn't find the strength to refuse. Instead, I made some tea and we sat in the kitchen to take a break. It was a strange moment. Just me, him, and this empty house that felt so different in his presence. More alive. "You look tired," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was gentle, but there was a genuine concern in it that made me uneasy. "It's been a long day," I replied, shrugging. "And renovations aren't really my thing." Adam smiled. "But you're doing great. Better than I expected." I chuckled, taking a sip of tea. "You're too kind. Probably just trying to keep me motivated." "No." He shook his head, his expression sincere. "Really? People often underestimate themselves. You just carry too much inside." The words caught me off guard, freezing me in place. His gaze was steady, and I felt a warmth rising in my chest, mixed with a deep, unsettling sensation. "Everyone carries something," I said quietly, looking away. "That doesn't make me special." "Maybe it does," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "You just don't see it." I didn't know how to respond. His words were so simple, yet they felt raw and unnerving, as if he was seeing something in me that I hadn't acknowledged in a long time. We shifted to lighter topics: movies, music. I told him about my love for old films, and he enthusiastically described his favorite soundtracks. The conversation flowed effortlessly, but it was still charged with something more. I realized how long it had been since I'd spoken so freely, since someone had listened to me with such genuine interest. At one point, he leaned closer to joke about a scene from a movie we both knew. His hand briefly brushed mine, a light, almost imperceptible touch that could have been accidental, but it felt like more. I pulled away quickly, too quickly, and he immediately withdrew. "Sorry," he said softly, looking slightly embarrassed. His gaze was gentle, but there was something in it I wasn't ready to confront. "It's fine," I replied, standing up abruptly. "We should get back to work." He nodded without protest, but as I returned to the bedroom, I found myself unable to focus. The evening, his words, his touch, they all stirred something I was trying desperately to ignore. Why was I letting myself feel this? Why now? By the time we finished painting, it was late. Adam packed up his things, saying he'd come by in the morning for the final touches. I walked him to the door, feeling the weight of conflicting emotions pressing down on me. When the door closed behind him, I stood alone in the quiet house, sensing something invisible hanging in the air, demanding an answer I couldn't yet give. I looked down at my hands, still smelling faintly of paint. What am I doing? I asked myself, but no answer came. The next day began quietly. As usual, Mike left for work early, and I was once again alone in the house. Adam arrived closer to noon, as always, with his tools and unshakable good mood. "Good morning," he said as he stepped into the apartment. His smile was light, but there was something in his eyes that distracted me from my usual thoughts. I nodded, offering a brief greeting, and headed to the bathroom where we were going to repaint an old shelf. We worked in silence. The bathroom was cramped, and the closeness of our shared space felt overwhelming. I avoided looking at him, focusing intently on even brush strokes. Yet I couldn't shake the sense of tension lingering in the air between us. "You're doing a good job," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Thanks," I replied, keeping my eyes on the shelf. His voice was soft, almost soothing, but I couldn't escape the feeling that he wasn't just talking about the paint. He fell silent again, and the quiet enveloped us once more. At some point, I noticed him move closer to pick up a brush that had fallen to the floor. His shoulder brushed mine ever so slightly, and I flinched, my heartbeat quickening. "Jessica," he said quietly. I turned and our eyes met. His gaze was intense but warm, as if he had been preparing for this moment for a long time. "I can't pretend anymore." "Pretend?" I echoed, my voice faltering. I knew what he meant, but I needed him to say it. "There's something between us," he said, stepping closer. "I felt it from the first day, and I can't ignore it anymore." My lips parted, but no words came. I was both stunned and terrified. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that it was all an illusion, but in that instant, I realized I felt it too. "Adam," I began, but he was already too close. His hand brushed mine lightly, and then, before I could fully comprehend what was happening, he leaned in and kissed me. The kiss was brief, but it carried a depth that made the world around us disappear. It was warmth, passion, and something forbidden, all wrapped into one overwhelming moment. Then, as quickly as it began, I pulled away, snapping back to reality. "We can't," I whispered, stepping back. My heart was racing, my breathing uneven. "This is wrong." "I'm sorry," he said, lowering his eyes. His voice was quiet, but it was full of sincerity. I couldn't hold it in any longer." He stepped back, creating space between us, but his gaze lingered, still heavy with the same emotions I felt, but didn't want to admit. "Adam, please, let's just forget this," I said, trying to sound firm. But even as I spoke, I knew my words lacked the weight they needed. "If that's what you want," he replied softly and left the bathroom, leaving me alone. I stood there, feeling the swirl of conflicting emotions inside me. Guilt, desire, fear. In the mirror's reflection, I saw my face, confused, pale. What have I just done? The question echoed in my mind over and over, but no answer came. After a long, tense day, I decided to take a shower. The hot water poured over me, washing away the exhaustion and scattering my thoughts. The bathroom filled with a light mist, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to relax. Fragments of memories swirled in my mind. Adam's voice, his gaze. Stepping out of the shower, I wrapped myself in a towel and twisted another around my damp hair, a familiar routine. The warmth radiating from my skin was soothing, comforting. I walked over to the mirror and switched on the hairdryer, its hum drowning out everything else. It was only after a few moments that I noticed the bathroom door slightly ajar. When I looked up, I saw Adam standing in the doorway, frozen as if he hadn't expected to see me like this. His expression shifted instantly. The faint smile faded, replaced by something deeper, more intense. I instinctively turned off the hairdryer, but inexplicably didn't step back. "Adam," I began, but my voice was softer than I intended. "Did you need something?" "Sorry," he said, his voice rough as though the words were difficult to form. "I thought you were finished." "I was just," I started to say, but the words trailed off again. He took a step forward, and the air between us seemed to thicken. "Jessica," he said, his voice gentle but imbued with a weight that made me meet his gaze despite myself. "Adam, don't," I whispered, but my words sounded feeble, unconvincing. I couldn't look away from him, nor could I force myself to leave the room. "I can't pretend anymore," he said, stopping just a step away from me. "Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you feel nothing, and I'll go." I couldn't answer. He raised his hand carefully, his fingertips brushing my cheek. Before I could stop him or myself, he leaned in and kissed me. For a fleeting moment, I let everything else slip away. Mike, this house, the glaring truth that this was a mistake. I let myself be consumed by the warmth, the forbidden passion of the moment. Then I pulled back, the reality of it crashing down. "Adam, we can't," I whispered, turning my head away. My hand trembled as I pressed it against my lips, still burning from his touch. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, taking a step back. There was pain in his eyes, but he didn't try to come closer again. He lingered for a moment longer before turning and leaving the bathroom without another word. I stood there, trembling, not from cold, but from the storm raging inside me. I looked at the mirror. The face staring back at me was my own, but I barely recognized it. What have I done? The question echoed in my mind, but no answer came. Only the weight of what had just happened and the impossible reality of what I now had to live with. After the kiss, I did everything I could to avoid Adam. Every step he took in the house, every glance he cast my way, it all felt like torture. Inside, emotions churned relentlessly, and no matter how hard I tried to escape them, they found me, catching me off guard at every turn. I felt trapped. In my home, in my feelings, in a life that no longer felt familiar. Adam, on the other hand, seemed calm. He continued his work, cracking jokes and occasionally asking how I was doing, but he never brought up what had happened between us. That silent agreement didn't make things easier. I couldn't stop thinking about the kiss, and worse, I couldn't shake the thought that it might happen again. Everything changed a few days later when Mike came home unexpectedly early. Usually, he would let me know if he planned to arrive before dinner, but that day, I simply heard the front door open. I barely had time to gather my thoughts before he was there, finding Adam and me in the living room. We were standing close. Too close. I was explaining how I wanted the furniture arranged, and Adam was leaning casually against the wall, that familiar, slightly teasing look in his eyes. And then, Mike's voice. "What's going on here?" I turned so quickly I almost lost my balance. Mike stood in the doorway, his expression closed off, but his eyes, icy, piercing, betrayed his suspicion. His gaze flicked between me and Adam, lingering just a fraction too long on Adam. The weight of his doubt was almost tangible. "We were discussing the renovation," I said quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. But even to my own ears, it sounded unconvincing. "Renovation," Mike repeated, stepping closer. He stopped right in front of Adam, looking him directly in the eyes. "You were supposed to finish the work this week." Adam straightened, his face calm, though tension simmered beneath the surface. There are a few finishing touches left. Jessica asked me to stay and finalize some details. Jessica asked. Mike echoed, shooting me a quick glance. There was something sharp in his eyes. Anger, pain, disappointment. All of it at once? Yes, I said quietly, but the words sounded like an excuse, and I could see how that struck a nerve. His expression tightened further. He was silent for a moment before turning to me. You know, Jessica, sometimes it's not the renovation that needs fixing. Mike, I began, but he cut me off. Don't, he said without turning back. I've seen enough. You don't understand. I tried to explain, but once again my words were interrupted. I see exactly what's happening. Maybe you think I haven't noticed, but I'm not an idiot, Jessica. Just tell me one thing. Does he matter to you? I froze. Saying no would be a lie, but yes would destroy everything. My silence became the answer. He nodded, as if he had been expecting it. Then that's all I need to know. Mike slammed the door so hard the sound echoed in my head. The dim evening light struggled to pierce through the old curtains, and the apartment suddenly felt dark and unfamiliar. I sat alone on the edge of the couch, staring at my hands in confusion. Everything around me was familiar, yet it felt as if I had stumbled into someone else's life. After Mike caught Adam and me in the living room, everything fell apart. He didn't create a scene or ask questions. And that was the scariest part. His silence weighed heavier than any argument could. He had seen what I had been so desperately trying to hide, perhaps even more than I was ready to admit to myself. I remembered the way he looked at me before leaving. There wasn't anger in his eyes, but something worse. Disappointment that made my chest tighten painfully. I couldn't find the words to say anything. How do you explain something you don't fully understand yourself? How do you justify feelings that seem to arise without your consent? In the kitchen, a notebook lay on the counter, the one I used to jot down grocery lists and ideas for the renovation. I picked it up, but instead of the usual to-dos, I began to write thoughts I couldn't voice. Why did I let this happen? What's wrong with me? Is this just passion, or did I truly want to destroy everything Mike and I built together? The more I wrote, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about Mike. It wasn't just about Adam either. It was about me. About the way I had been living. Or not living over the past few years. I felt blindsided. Not by the situation, but by myself. This wasn't infidelity in the conventional sense. It was a desperate attempt to fill a void I hadn't even realized was there. But I still couldn't pinpoint exactly what was missing.